Good morning, I'm Mayor Tommy Roberts. Welcome back to the Mayor's Table. I want to dedicate this segment of the Mayor's Table to a recap and review of the recently completed legislative session in the state of New Mexico. The session began in mid-January. It was concluded on February 16th. The governor had until March 9th to exercise her veto power. And so we're in a position now to go back, take a look at some of the legislation that we felt was important to the city of Farmington and to its citizens. And we'll talk about those pieces of legislation and tell you how they were disposed of in this short legislative session of 30 days. My guest once again this morning is City Manager Rob Mays. Rob, welcome.
Thank you.
Rob, probably the most important piece of legislation that was introduced in this legislative session in terms of importance to the city of Farmington was the hold harmless legislation, which was referred to as House Bill 233. Can you talk just quickly about what House Bill 233 proposed to do?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Right out of the chute in this session, we had a serious scare about a piece of legislation proposed that could have truly hurt us significantly. To fully understand the context of it, you do have to go back a little bit in time, 2 years prior, when House Bill 641 was passed, and through that legislation, the state determined that they are going to transfer from the city revenues what ultimately will be 10% of our, actually 12% of our GRT is going to be transferred to the state, phased out over a 15-year period. To put that in perspective, it's $5.8 million in the first 5 years. The first 15 years, $46 million. 20 years, $75 million. By year 50, $250 million. That is the law of the land. Right out of the chute in this legislative session, legislation was introduced to come back after the city and the county for more. And essentially what was proposed in House Bill 233 was another $20 million on top over the next 15 years, another $20 million. So on top of the $47 million they're taking from us, they would have come up for another $20.9 million. Next year alone, the current fiscal year budget that we're facing right now, we would have lost an additional $3.8 million. Year two, 7.2, and it's just exponential from there. So it would have been devastating to us. That's, you and I mobilized immediately and got a hold of our local legislative session or legislative group and began to talk about the impacts of this.
And we made a trip to Santa Fe to meet with the sponsor of the legislation and with other key legislators in addition to our own representatives from San Juan County. And we had a good opportunity to talk about the implications of this legislation on the city of Farmington. Frankly, I saw this as a punitive measure. It was, I think, very much designed to go after those counties and cities that acted in accordance with the legislation that was passed earlier, 641. Mm-hmm. So counties and cities were exercising the taxing authority granted to them under that piece of legislation, so they were acting in good faith. I argued, were acting not only within the letter of the law, but within the spirit of the law, as we waited for some time before we took action to implement any of the taxing authority that was given to us.
Yeah, and add insult to injury. As you know, the city of Farmington has taken a very conservative approach to taxation. City of Farmington hadn't raised taxes since 1998. The city council was forced to put in 2 1/8 increments to generate revenue to replace this 12% of our revenue that the state is taking from us. Ultimately, that tax increase was imposed, and the city and our citizens won't see one additional penny from it. In fact, the 2/8 isn't even enough to replace what the state is taking from us. So the idea of them coming back for more was just somewhat amazing to consider.
I think the mobilization efforts had good impact and good effect, obviously, because the bill died in the House Ways and Means Committee. Ironically, this is a committee that is chaired by the sponsor of the legislation. But I think he saw very quickly in the process that almost all counties and municipalities throughout the state were opposed to this legislation. It was not only those who had implemented all or some portion of the taxing authority, it included many of those counties and cities, most if not all, because they also could see that if this measure was successful, then there are other things that might be done in subsequent legislative sessions to undermine their fiscal positions vis-a-vis the hold harmless authority.
Well, it really deals with a bigger concern that all the municipalities and counties have. When the state is under pressure financially, their pattern has been with this legislation to turn to take the money from the cities and counties so that they can maintain a position of having not raised taxes to solve their fiscal challenges. The fact is, whatever the economic environment is that causes challenges for the state, we're facing those first on the front lines of services that we offer. So simply taking revenue out of the existing tax base that has been dedicated to cities and counties in order to solve the state's fiscal problems is just blatantly unfair and unreasonable.
Well, we can conclude that we're fortunate that this proposal went nowhere, and I have some level of confidence that we've seen the end of these proposals to continue to tweak the hold harmless issue. And I think it's best left alone at this point. Many counties and cities have taken action based on the law as it currently stands, and I think the best policy is to let those actions stand. So I'm hopeful that we won't be dealing with it next year during the legislative session. Let's talk briefly about House Bill 171, which we refer to as the Return to Work proposal. Tell us about that proposal.
Well, this was a limited bill that under certain circumstances, retired employees that are retired when the state's sponsored retirement program could return to work without giving up their pensions. It was limited to law enforcement only, and it was primarily designed to address the growing concerns of, particularly in Albuquerque and other places where they're having trouble hiring police officers, and they're having so many retirements. And so it's aimed at allowing the potential on a limited basis for cities to hire back retired police officers either from another jurisdiction or their own.
This is a piece of legislation on which we didn't fare so well. This bill passed the House but died in the Senate Public Affairs Committee. Do you anticipate that we'll be pushing for this kind of legislation next year as well?
Yeah, I think that the critical issue of a shortage of police officers will eventually get people to be more open-minded and to try to understand the true fiscal impacts of it. It's the so-called double dipping that has a very bad taste in the mouth of citizens, but what they don't recognize is that it really isn't double dipping. The employee and the municipality continues to pay into the retirement fund, and no additional long-term benefits are derived from that. So the fact is, it's actually good fiscally from a standpoint of the solvency of the retirement fund, and from a standpoint of the investment we've made. By the time a police officer goes through their career here, we've invested in many cases tens, if not $100,000 in their training. To see them retire in year 20, go to another state, and as opposed to where we could keep them for a few more years in our own state and take advantage of that investment we've made in those police officers. So I think the crisis of the shortage of police officers will eventually reach a level where people recognize we've got to do something to address that, and this is one very valid, rational approach to that.
Let's talk about the capital outlay bill. We had a request for $500,000 in the capital outlay appropriations proposal, and that was for our Villa View detention pond system. We had received an allocation in the prior year's legislative session capital outlay bill of a little over $700,000. So I think together we're about halfway there in fully funding the detention pond system that we have planned, and we'll probably be making an additional request for additional money for the balance of that money next legislative session. In the meantime, we're able to have money available to pursue the design phase, but we're still going to need more money to get into the construction and operation phase.
Well, as you said, it's a system through the foothills area, and so it's very easily feasible. We've been committed to kind of sticking with one project till it's done and not getting a bunch of capital outlay money that we can't use. So the design is funded, and now with a combination of this year's allotment, we'll be able to actually construct phase one and then look for funding mechanisms to continue the process. It goes all the way from up in the foothills area all the way down to East Main and down towards the river. So it's a fairly extensive project.
And our project survived the governor's veto
Yeah.
and the line item veto power that she has. Several capital outlay projects throughout the state did not survive the line item veto, so we're fortunate that we can count on that money. I think we want to kind of wind down. We've talked about the three pieces of legislation that we were most focused on. I would also just note that House Bill 29, which would have given local governments the option to implement curfews, passed the House but died in the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is a proposal that I supported primarily because it would have given to local governments and municipalities an option to enact curfew legislation. I had not developed an opinion as to whether we would pursue that authority in Farmington, but I felt it was important that we have that authority, and there are a lot of arguments, pros and cons on that. Bottom line is, though, that we won't be dealing with that issue in the near term. Rob, thank you for being with me again this morning. I think we had committed from an earlier Mayor's Table segment to revisit the legislative session after its completion,
That's right.
and we've accomplished that now. I hope viewers are better informed now about that process. Thank you for joining us this morning on the Mayor's Table, and we'll look forward to having you back next Monday.